Hey class, this is our final lecture in Poly 201, and we're talking about interest groups. And I know I always say this, but interest groups are probably one of my favorite chapters to go through. It's interesting, yeah, and it's actually a really short chapter. There's not a ton to go over, and it's not overly complicated, but I like going over this chapter because I like to see how students, and I wish I could talk with you through this, in a dialogue, but it's nice to see how students go from, thinking about interest groups as a big evil type of institution and how our government operates to seeing them as a necessary evil, and then all the way to, at the end of the semester, kind of really understanding that they play a really valuable role in our democratic society. And so it's really neat to see the transition that students face. Now, some don't, some do. Here we are. But typically when we think of interest groups, we think of them as just being really scummy people that go to Washington and buy votes. They want to get Congress people to vote to support their big business, right? But interest groups aren't just about big business. Interest groups are there and available for anybody to use to influence legislation. And so these interest groups, they get together and they have a common interest in how they want to see policy either created, implemented. And so their job is to influence legislation in either what government does, what government doesn't do, or how government does what it's going to do, right? And so they hope to represent the interest of those that support their cause. So we're going to go through the chapter. Like I said, it's kind of quick. But we'll start off with me giving you a definition of what an interest group is. So interest groups are organized groups of people seeking to influence public policy. That's it. Now, it's common misconception that interest groups are political parties. So on the exam, for example, I may ask, is the Republican Party an interest group? No. If you think back to what a political party is, political parties are interested in achieving a portion of control in the government, like in government, through election. Interest groups are all about influencing policy outside of government, right? So not with elections. Interest group, no elections. Political parties, elections. So they're very different in how they want to influence government. So the answer then is political groups are not, or political parties are not interest groups. Political parties are not interest groups. All right, so then interest groups, we know that they're organized groups of people seeking to influence public policy. They usually have a common interest, and they do that by lobbying. So lobbying is the verb then. If interest group is the noun, lobbying is what interest groups do. It's the verb. And lobbying is any activity where individuals, interest groups, other institutions that may not even call themselves an interest group per se, influence public policy by persuading government officials to influence their group position. So lobbying is not just for interest groups, although interest groups definitely lobby. But I can participate in lobbying. And not just by joining an interest group, I can myself lobby my elected officials. So can you. So can anybody else in the United States. If you're a voting member, even sometimes if you're not a voting member or a citizen, you can still seek to lobby people in elected positions. A lobbyist is a professional who works to influence public policy in favor of their client's interest. Now, lobbyists are hired by interest groups, but am I a lobbyist? So I just said that I have the opportunity to lobby. I can lobby, but am I a lobbyist? No, it doesn't really make me a lobbyist. A lobbyist is a professional term, right? It's like saying, well, never mind. I'm not going to give you that analogy. But anyway, a lobbyist is about those professionals who sometimes they work for specific organizations. Their goal is, for example, to work for, let's say, GM Motors, right? They have lobbyists that they employ, and they absolutely lobby on the interest of GM. Some lobbyists are just a lobbyist for anybody who wants them to be. And as long as they're not, so they have an office open where they're a lobbyist, and as long as there's not, competing interest in the groups they represent, they can represent different groups, different people at different times. right? So a lobbyist is about professionals who work to influence policy. One of the reasons that a lobbyist is seen as a professional is that somebody who does this for a living really understands the ins and outs of how government works. They understand the processes of how legislation is passed, the processes of how rules are made, and they understand the access points and have access to elected officials, and elected officials know that. A lot of times lobbying groups seem really out of reach. And again, to sort of emphasize that lobbying itself is not bad. Sometimes, I guess, lobbyists can do bad things. The same with interest groups. But lobbying is all about trying to let your elected officials understand what your interests are. So groups of people get together and they form official lobbying groups. Now, in order to be, you have to actually apply to be an official lobbying group. If you want to make it official, and these are some of those that I found. So the American Corn Growers Association is a group of corn farmers in the U.S., and their goal is to lobby legislation that in any way might affect their livelihood, their ability to grow corn. It might have to do with corn subsidies, but they're there to make sure that their interests are protected. Then we have the National Air Transportation Association. This is a lobbying group that's been around for a while, and this is a group that really focuses on legislation that may affect air travel, airplanes, things like that. Now, all of these different airlines, Delta, American, United, they may have their own individual lobbyists, but they're all probably members of the National Air Transportation Association, and so that one individual lobbying group can kind of speak for everybody. You all have probably heard of the National Rifle Association. This is a group of gun rights enthusiasts, people who want to make sure that their interest to either do competitive shooting, hunting, just to own a firearm, the Second Amendment is protected. I've mentioned the ACLU, the American Civil Liberties Union. These are groups that often, or this is a group that often they're litigious against U.S. government or state governments, in that they want to support any minorities having their day in court. They want to make sure that minorities are afforded all civil liberties and civil rights that any other group is afforded. And they have a focus on really honing in on groups that are openly discriminated against, prejudiced against, that sort of thing. The Automobile Association is a kind of well-known, not well-known interest group. I say that because you all have heard of, this is AAA. You've heard of AAA. Now, AAA is the card that some of you may be on your parents' AAA. Your parents may have purchased this for you. So you have this little card, and it's your AAA card, and it has this number on it. And if you break down or somewhere, you can call them, and you can get yourself towed free of charge. Of course, you or maybe your parents or whoever your guardian is will pay for that privilege. It's like $100 a month. In addition to that, though, the American Automobile Association, or AAA, has tons of benefits for their members. So not only do you get kind of free, towing, that sort of thing. If you get I locked my keys in my car about a month ago. AAA was there. So not only that, but you also get a lot of really cool discounts. Whether it's to a theme park or staying at a hotel, if you type in your AAA number, you're likely to get a discount wherever it is that you're going. And then finally, the Marijuana Policy Project, who lobbies. Now, most of these Marijuana Policy Project or marijuana lobbyist groups, they're most effective right now, not just at the national level, but really effective in their states. And so a lot of these groups are state level, and they work within their own states, like Colorado and California and Kentucky and South Carolina, to try to get marijuana legalized, right? And it's seen as a legitimate business. Anyway, so these are all examples of lobbying groups. And as you can see, when you think about what they represent, it makes you kind of reconsider that nasty idea of what a lobbyist is, or what we think a lobbyist might be sometimes. So why do interest groups? Why does lobbying persist? So it's logical for us, with how our government is structured, to join interest groups. The purpose is, when we get together to join an interest group or when we contribute to an interest group, it's to influence decisions of government. And honestly, we're more effective. Individuals who want to influence government are far more effective by banding together with others that have the same ideals and asking really, really smart, powerful friends to help out, right? So we get to, myself, I don't know a lot of elected officials actually, I don't think I know any but 2 elected officials at the federal level right now. And I certainly don't know them well enough to call them up and say, hey, can I get a meeting with you? I want to talk to you about policy X, Y, and Z. So I band together with other people who have similar interests to me. And together we can hire professional lobbyists, ask powerful and smart friends to help out, that sort of thing. So it's logical for us, if we really do have an interest in influencing government, that we join together. Secondly, the second bullet point here, interest groups help government officials. So this is something that's less well known. Government officials look at tons of policy all the time, at the state level, at the federal level, and they're not experts in everything. We've talked about this before. So how then do government officials or elected officials really know what's good policy and what's not good policy? And I've mentioned before too that policy affects everybody. So how can they really assess the policy consequences if they don't know everything about the policy they're trying to promote? I guess vote against. This is where interest groups come in. Interest groups help gain support for whatever their cause is by informing government officials. So they provide information to elected officials, technical information. They want government officials to know what their interests are and why their interests are important. Now, a lot of people think, well, couldn't interest groups just lie to government officials? Couldn't they lie to elected officials to get elected officials to do what they want? They could. This doesn't work out very well, though. Typically what happens is, if a lobbyist is known as a liar or somebody that can't be trusted by elected officials, they're usually blacklisted from Congress, Capitol Hill, wherever they're at. And so then they can no longer have access to these government officials. So there has to be a mutual trust between the elected officials and the lobbyists. Also, professional lobbyists are specialists. And so if I think about, this kind of relates back to logical for individuals to join interest groups. Professional lobbyists are specialists in an area. They know how to navigate the policymaking process in a way that even you and me don't know. And then finally, lobbying as a profession has emerged with modern representative government. That if we really want to influence government, because government has expanded so much at the federal level, interest groups are the appropriate response to that, right? Being organized, trying to reach the level of government that's the most important for whatever cause we're fighting for, that sort of thing. So these are why interest groups persist and why it's logical for us to join interest groups. I want to make a note to move over this really quickly. We've talked about Federalist 10 before. Remember, the Federalist Papers are these documents that were published by the Federalists, those who supported the 1787 Constitution. And their goal was to publish these documents to try to convince people to ratify the Constitution. One of the things that Madison, the father of our Constitution, talked about in Federalist 10 was factions. He talked about people being able to, pursue their selfish aims that are contrary to the rights of others, that were contrary to the public interest, things that were basically factions that would make a threat to popular government. What if the wrong people got a hold of government and used government to do things that didn't benefit the common good? So the United States, and how the fact that we're a republic, and it is so large, and we have a federal system, and all the varying levels of government provide a system where interest groups can prevent tyranny of the majority and can really demonstrate the diversity of interests that we have in the United States. So Madison's solution here to preventing factions and the tyranny of the majority was to divide authority up between federal institutions envisioned in the Constitution. That includes our federal system. And the fragmentation of this government authority, whether it's within the federal government or whether it's between the state and the federal government, would prevent any single faction from dominating government. So the nation's diversity would essentially foster this, big competing interest. And while we can do that on our own by casting a vote for or against somebody that we want elected, a lot of times when somebody gets in office, they need to know continually, actually this is not a lot of times, but most of the time, elected officials need to know continually, what do we want, what do we not want as the constituents? And so interest groups can help tell them. So when we look at the origins of interest groups and how they kind of evolved, it initially started with merchants, manufacturers, ethnic, religious minorities, and these groups together started looking for favorable policies, from authorities either at home or abroad in parliament. They did things like submitted petitions. They hired agents to talk with ministers and lesser bureaucrats. They examined voting records of legislatures. So this started really early in the colonial era, even before the United States became a nation. In the colonial era, there were two types of lobbying that we see happening even today. The first is insider lobbying. Now, like I said, it was happening in the colonial era, and it's happening even today. And this is lobbying by narrowly focused interests. And the reason we call it insider lobbying is because this is the direct lobbying for government officials or to government officials. You're talking to people who actually control the votes, who were actually going to cast their votes, and the people who are going to be doing that, so you're able to kind of get on the inside track and influence policy in that way. Now, outsider lobbying, also done today and is still effective, is the tactic of appealing to the general public for support. So basically, instead of going to the government and saying, hey, vote like this, vote like this, vote like this, you're going to the people and saying, hey, the government should vote like this. And so together, the public then puts pressure on government officials by saying, yeah, the government should do this. And so we saw different groups do that. And again, we still see groups do that today. But at this point, of course, this is the colonial era, so most interest group activities were directed at state and local governments because those were the groups that had the biggest influence on them. Now, in the early republic, we see the emergence of interest groups, and it's kind of in the early portion where we really start to see, when maybe lobbying might have gotten its dirty name. Okay, so we see that government's activities are expanding, and people who wanted to shape the decisions of government expanded their efforts too, creating professional lobbying groups, that sort of thing. Mainly at this point, we saw new groups, like really large-scale industrial corporations that were lobbying in ways that were seen as being negative, right? So buying votes, that sort of thing. And a lot of these laws led to, child labor, wage, work hours, so on. But there were some good innovations that were created by lobbying groups like women's suffrage and federal income tax, which, odd that your book points out federal income tax was a good thing. Usually taxes aren't seen as a good thing. At any rate, so earlier groups had been local, short-lived, but these new groups that were emerging in the early republic were really, really big, large-scale organizations. Now, if all of a sudden these groups start coming up and they're really well organized and only the really rich people can have access to these groups, then we may begin to see an imbalance with the power of government. Who really has the power? Is it the rich and influential, or is it anybody that can access government? And at this point, for a while, for some time at least, interest groups were kind of left to those that were rich and affluential. Now, in defense of interest groups, like I said, government expanded, interest groups expanded, and it took a while for everybody to really catch on of what's happening with interest groups, all right? It's no longer about the early insider, outsider tactics, that sort of thing. It's no longer the local state level, but we're looking at big organized organizations, like really big organized groups. So in defense of interest groups, your book talks about a concept called pluralism. Pluralism is, like I said, a concept, and it describes a political system in which all other significant social interests freely compete with one another's influence over government's decisions. Now, we live in a pluralistic society, or at least that's what the United States was intended to be. And we're pluralistic in that, theoretically, we all have the ability to freely compete with one another's influence over government, right? Whether it's, and not really in voting against somebody or for a candidate, but our influence over government can be in joining and creating an interest group that really represents what we believe. So in 1951, your authors talk about Truman's The Governmental Process, which kind of outlines about pluralism. And Truman noted that because groups were free to organize and participate, the political process itself allowed for balanced competing interests. So yes, we had tons of groups vying for government's attention, but every group had an opportunity to vie for government attention. Now, even the potential threat, according to Truman, of opposition organizing can prevent established groups from overreaching. So basically, in order for our pluralistic society to really thrive, we need all groups of people to constantly try to reach in and influence government and not just let one group really gain control. So the American political system, as I mentioned, was particularly conducive to pluralistic politics. We're decentralized, meaning that we have a unified national government, but there's also state and local governments. And elected officials, because they represent so many different constituents and such a diverse constituency, they need information to do that. But some people think that this conception of American government as a pluralistic political system is a little too sunny. Essentially, a lot of people think that pluralism doesn't allow everything it says it allows because money, information, access to authority, skills, bargaining power are distributed across the populace in a very uneven way. That some people have a lot of access to government, some people don't. Some people have a lot of skills understanding how government works, some people don't. Some people have a lot of money, some people don't. Now, how does this bear out? We've talked a lot about collective action, okay? So collective action meaning, getting a bunch of people together to actually participate in forming interest groups, things like this. So when we talk about groups actually forming potential lobbying groups, there are incentives that organizations can offer that can help collective action problem better. For example, so small groups, a small interest group, has some advantages. A small interest group is much easier to organize than large ones. Now, it's better if the small interest group has a lot of money, okay? Interest groups with a lot at stake, those are going to be easier to organize than people that have very little at stake, right? So for some people, certain issues, there's more at stake with them than with others. You may, for example, I'm thinking about in my constitutional law class, we're talking about the death penalty. And you may have your opinions about the death penalty, whether it's cruel and unusual punishment or not, whether it should be allowed in the U.S. or not. But if people really want to affect it, an individual that really wants to affect it might be more inclined to join an interest group in order to affect policy in that way if, for example, they had a family member who was on death row or they had a family member who something was done to somebody and they were in a state that didn't offer the death penalty. So if people have stuff at stake, then they're going to be more apt to really want to participate. So when we think about what the federal government allows, air transportation, airplane businesses like that to do, Oftentimes people say that, okay, so airliners never think about the passengers, and laws that are written about air traffic travel are written for the corporations and not for the individuals that are actually flying, or that are actually flying, right? The ones that are the consumers that are using the service. That may be true. But here's the thing. Airlines have dedicated interest groups. If airline passengers would put significant effort in forming an interest group, they too might be able to have the influence. So in order to try, so if you're in an interest group, if you're somebody that does have a lot of things at stake and you're trying to get people on board with your idea of what the government should or shouldn't do, then how are you going to get people involved? How are you going to overcome the collective action problem? All right, so first, you can use a moral incentive. If you want to get people involved in interest groups, then you can really sell. Listen, if you get involved in this interest group, you're going to have personal satisfaction that comes with active participation. You're going to be satisfied when you contribute. You're going to be satisfied when you're involved. And a lot of groups like pro-life groups, animal rights groups, the ASPCA, that's if you watch TV late at night on Sunday nights, there's a Sarah McLachlan commercial with a bunch of dogs and cats that are being terribly abused. And they are asking for you to contribute, and they're using the moral incentive to get you to do that. Okay. Another way that groups get people to overcome the collective action problem is through selective incentives. So these are goods or benefits that, hey, if you join our coalition of those who are in favor of this interest, if you join our interest group, we will provide you with reasons to do that, meaning AAA, for example, provides roadside assistance. So some people join AAA having no idea they're even an interest group. Some organizations offer things with donations. The NRA provides duffel bags if you donate a certain amount, or they did it one time. Sometimes it's little pins, but little incentives to get people to participate. Now, when we look at contemporary interest groups today, we see that, like I said, interest groups have expanded at the rate that government has expanded. And now we have private sector organizations and government, even government entities, like even government organizations that participate in lobbying activity. Most advocacy groups are already, formed from people. Well, they're created by people that are already kind of a formed group. We see that some interest groups have patrons that provide outside assistance. Not every group depends on outside assistance. AAA, let's look at AARP. AARP is the interest group for older Americans. It's the Association for Retired Americans. I forget the acronym. But there's a fee that you pay, right? And so while AARP may not have like significant people giving money, like tons of money just throwing at AARP, AARP is able to be really, really successful because they get a lot of small donations from a lot of people. So because of that, you see at the bottom bullet point, many prominent public interest groups are financed mainly by membership dues and small contributions, like AAA and AARP. Why have we seen interest groups proliferate? So your book talks about 5 things that have affected the proliferation of interest groups, why we've seen so many interest groups grow. One is social ferment, meaning you see a lot of people around you doing things that inspire you to promote social change. So the civil rights movement, the right to life movement, all of these are reasons that interest groups have proliferated. We also see a growing affluent middle class. Now, I know that you hear that the middle class is disappearing, but there's still people out there with extra money and time, and they want to invest in something that excites their moral imaginations. And so because so many people have some excess income that they can give, be it $5, $10, or $20, or even $100 a year, it incentivizes them, or rather encourages them to look for groups to give to. Technological innovations have really caused interest groups to rise. So now we see groups using Twitter, Facebook, email, a lot of technological marketing to find potential new supporters. And so more people are, joining interest groups because Well, they didn't know until now that they existed, certain ones anyway. The federal government has also encouraged the growth of interest groups. So the U.S. Chamber of Commerce, business roundtables were created under the leadership of the Secretary of Commerce and the Department of Agriculture, right? So, or rather, the American Farm Bureau was made up by advisory councils of the Department of Agriculture. A lot of times we see government organizations, they understand the benefits that can be seen through interest groups inserting information into government policies, and so they want to help foster that by creating interest groups of their own. And then finally, a lot of groups are joining together in defense of government programs. They see a government program that is possibly going to go away, and they want to join together. Like Social Security is in very bad shape. Like I've told you before, don't plan on having Social Security when you're retired. So we see AARP, the American Association of Retired Persons. There it is. There's the acronym. Anyway, so they were formed when Social Security and Medicare were developed by the federal government to make sure that they were continually funded. So what do interest groups do? Well, they survive. They want to retain people that will donate so they can pay the bills and provide the resources needed to continue to lobby. How they generate resources really does affect how a group goes about their political activity. So let's move on. So I mentioned early tactics of interest groups were insider tactics and outsider tactics. We still use those today, but one of the third ways that interest groups can really influence government is through litigation. The ACLU, right? The NAACP, those are all interest groups that can file amicus curiae briefs in Supreme Court cases or federal cases, state Supreme Court cases. And they find that litigation is often the best way to really provoke change. At least that's what happened with the Civil Rights Movement. Now, we think about lobbying as being a really flashy kind of job. Unfortunately, it's not. You get to wear suits, I think, kind of. But usually what lobbyists do are things like testify at hearings. They present research results, technical information. They send letters to members of the group to tell them about its activities. They meet with other groups that might have overlapping interests. They help draft legislation. So a lot of what they do is really not overly exciting, right? So let's move on. Now, a recent development akin to interest groups are political action committees. So these are federally registered groups that pools money from individuals to give to elect or defeat political candidates in election. So the idea is there are federal elections rules that limit and in some ways police, or I guess regulate is a better word. They regulate how much people can influence elected officials in terms of how much money they can donate. Political action committees were a way to form groups of people together who, let me tell you this, I don't have $100,000 that I can give to a politician so that politician will listen to me and say, oh my goodness, thank you for this donation. Why did you donate? What is it that you want me to do for you? So I don't have $100,000 lying around. What I can do, though, is join together with other people who may have an extra $5 laying around. And if we get enough people together, maybe we form one political action committee, and the political action committee can pool their resources, all of those $5, and maybe together we make a $100,000 donation and really catch the attention of a political candidate that's likely to win. Now, usually political action committees are, again, seen in a very negative light. And political action committees can be really sneaky. They certainly can. And your book actually talks about this. They talk about soft money, dark money, things like that. We do see that most political action committee gives money to winners. All right. So does that mean that if you get a donation from a political action committee that you're all of a sudden going to win an election? Not necessarily. Political action committees, if they're going to invest in somebody, they want to invest in somebody who has a good chance of winning. Now, in terms of political action committees making donations and trying to tie those donations to roll call votes, research tells us that there's no real connection, and here's why. Political action committees it would not behoove them to spend money trying to get people who don't support their cause to vote for whatever cause they support. What it does behoove a political action committee to do is to try to find people that are going to support their cause already, that already have an interest in supporting their cause, and then saying, you're the kind of person we want to see elected. And so they try to get that person elected. So when you see political action committees donating to a specific individual, and then you see that specific individual placing roll call votes in favor of things that the political action committee likes, is that happening because the elected official bought the vote? Probably not. All indications point to the fact that political action committees are already donating to people who were already interested in doing things for that group already. So they already have like an inclination to support the policies of that group. Some interest groups you've noticed are more successful than others. Why is that? Two reasons. One, the saliency of the interest group. So how interested are Americans in what that group is trying to do? And how much do Americans really care about it? Is the interest group issue actually something that people care about? So the salience. The second thing is conflict. So to what extent do other groups really oppose a policy change or want the policy change? So it's a little bit akin to salience, conflict is, but conflict is, is it a divisive issue? Do we see people really in favor or really against? And those two things together can help interest groups be more or less successful. Now, interest groups, like I said, are controversial and thriving. Your book talks about iron triangles. It talked about it in the chapter on bureaucracy, and we mentioned it before, how sometimes interest groups get so ingrained in government that we find that they begin to influence government in a way that maybe government never intended. So there's a lot of new research coming out right now where people focus on, how accessible is this idea of a pluralistic society to ordinary people like you and me? Is it just for people who have tons of money and tons of extra time? And is it just for people with big industries? While it's true that they do have an upper hand, there's been some research that suggests that due to technological advances and social ferment, things like that, that it's allowed people, ordinary people like you and me, to be able to be really active players and policy advocates. So anyway, all of that together is kind of the reason that interest groups are really controversial, and yet we see them thriving. Now, I might add this. I hope that by the end of this lecture that you will have kind of thought differently about interest groups. I hope that if there's something that you're really, really passionate about, that you research it and find if there is an interest group out there, and maybe you can get involved. Not in money per se, but maybe you can volunteer your time to really affect change if there's something that you're really interested in. All right, so that is it for Chapter 13, and we are, well, actually there won't be any other lectures, but your final will be available soon. In the meantime, if you have any questions, feel free and contact me.